Derek, your career epitomizes that which is stereotyped by many U.S. geographers of British geographers, that is, receiving a PhD at an extremely early age, at least compared to those in the United States, and then launching into a brilliant career. What I would like you to do, if you will, is tell us a little bit about undergraduate and graduate training at Cambridge.
I think before I move into that, I should say that the one misconception there is, maybe two misconceptions, but the one I ought to talk about is that I received my PhD comparatively late. And I received it late for all sorts of reasons, but one of them was because within 1 year of completing my undergraduate training and embarking upon postgraduate research, I was offered an assistant lectureship at Cambridge. And that meant, obviously, a tremendous amount of time had to be spent not just in preparing lectures and going over a much wider range of materials than I'd intended to cover in my own research program, but simply trying to learn how to lecture itself and how to teach. And so that delayed the formal award of a PhD for many, many years. So the career was rolling, brilliant or otherwise, well before the PhD even limped out of the garage. But yes, the undergraduate training at Cambridge was, I think, extraordinarily important. It was a 3-year single honours course, which meant that it was quite impossible in any formal sense to pursue any other subjects. And the course was bursting at the seams to such an extent that there wouldn't have been really the hours in the day to pursue much else. And it operated, I suppose, on two levels. The University of Cambridge is a collegiate university, which means that while on the one hand the university itself has to provide lectures, formal courses of instruction, and conduct examinations, each individual college has to arrange its own informal teaching program through a system of tutorials and supervisions. Now that meant that I was exposed to two sorts of influence, really. On the one hand, like everyone else reading geography at the time, I had exactly the same sort of lectures from every member of the faculty. And within the faculty as a whole, I suppose very, very early on, I became interested in historical geography. Not, I think, because of some preconceived interest in the past. I hadn't studied history at A-level, advanced level, but rather because of the quality of the ideas that were being articulated and the tremendous excitement that was being put across to us. And it's interesting that even in the first 2 years, when the opportunities for specialisation in historical geography were at best minimal, some of the most exciting courses were given by historical geographers in fields outside their own immediate specialisation. So that, for example, we had a course which I'm sure in retrospect was scratched together at the last moment to plug gaps in the syllabus, but nevertheless a course in regional geography of Europe, which consisted of lectures from Alan Baker, John Langton, and Harold Fox. And there was a commitment in those courses, on the one hand to those places and the people that lived in them, but also to a sensitive theoretical exposure. Now, within the college, on the other hand, Sydney, Sussex, my director of studies was Richard Chorley, and his lectures, to me as to everyone else, were certainly inspirational. Many people described them as music hall with maths, and there was the same sense of excitement, the same sense of dynamism there. But I was lucky enough to get that on a much closer personal basis in supervisions in college. And Dick Chorley has always been important to me, but perhaps never more so than during those undergraduate years, and also much more recently. There was a period in between when I strayed from the path and moved into historical geography, which exposed me to other kinds of influences. But as an undergraduate, his sense of intellectual excitement and challenge, his refusal to accept that geography could be anything other than intellectually demanding, rigorous, and exciting, that you had to continually go out from what was accepted as a common core and really challenge and rethink what was going on, was, I suppose, extraordinarily important in making me think that this was a subject which really mattered. And it was very much the people that taught me, therefore, just as much as the ideas, which were the key.
Could you elaborate on some of the individuals other than Chorley?
Well, yes. I hadn't mentioned the head of department at the time, Professor Darby, who was, of course, absolutely committed to historical geography and to a very particular vision of historical geography. It was a vision which was based on the patient, careful, scholarly interrogation of sources, and in particular, their interrogation in essentially cartographic terms. His great survey of the Doomsday Geography of England, for example, was based on exactly that kind of appraisal. And his explanations, I think, of the patterns and structures that he uncovered were also essentially cartographic, essentially morphological. His great account of the changing English landscape, for example, revolved around the clearing of the wood, the draining of the fen, essentially visible landscape processes. And I never found that as intellectually exciting, as scholarly though it undoubtedly was, as the sort of ideas which the other historical geographers I mentioned, Alan Baker, Jack Langton and Harold Fox, were exploring, because their sense of explanation seemed to me to be one which forced you to go into social theory in a much more rigorous way, to try to make sense of the innermost workings of society and economy. And their sense of the subject, therefore, was not a compartmentalized, fragmented one. There was no sense of geography being some kind of rigorously autonomous discipline, but rather one which was changing and developing all the time. And that, of course, was exactly the point, again, of Chorley's forays into systems theory, that these simple divisions were getting in the way of some kind of rigorous exposure of the world in which we live. There were, of course, all sorts of other people lecturing there, all sorts. We had courses in statistics from Barbara Kennedy, conducted in an enormous room with Bunsen burners and gas tanks and old creaking calculators which we had to queue up to punch numbers in. We had David Stoddart, who had, again, a tremendous sense of fun as well as intellectual excitement. And his practical classes, I remember, involved us in, just to give an example, working on maps of coral atolls. And we had to patiently spend 2 hours working on these enormous charts, tracing these coral atolls. And then we had to define their area. Now, of course, that's extraordinarily difficult. You've got these tiny little charts which you've constructed. So what he asked us to do was cut round each of these atolls, gather together all the clippings that were left and weigh them, weigh a square centimetre of paper and convert one to the other. So part of my time was spent not simply queuing up for the calculator, but queuing up with these confetti scraps to weigh these pieces of paper and just come to some conclusion at the end of the day. There was a lot of that kind of communal lab work, the results of which I was never really fully aware of, but which at least gave us much more fun, I suspect, than some of the more, if you like, professional training that we offer our undergraduates now. It's very high-tech, but it's beautifully sanitized. It's all automatic, really. You don't interact with the people around about you. You punch buttons and numbers flash up on screens. And the thought of queuing up, as we had to over our lunch break, to weigh pieces of paper, wouldn't go down at all, but it was fun.
Now, that is fascinating because, as you well know, our response would be to buy a $10,000 digitizer and approach the problem that way.
Yeah, we had lots of equipment like that in the basement, covered with polythene sheets, but I think most people were afraid that if you switched it on, you electrocuted either yourself or the students.
Now, when you entered graduate training, as most U.S. geographers are quite aware, it's quite different in the British system. Whereas we take formal coursework, you're essentially doing independent work, and working on your dissertation. Can you describe that a bit for us? Is it done in isolation, or was it done in isolation? Was there much camaraderie amongst the graduate students at Cambridge?
In one sense, yes, it is done in isolation, simply because it's very rare for there to be any, or at least at the time it was very rare, for there to be any large-scale research projects being undertaken in which postgraduate students might fit as, in effect, research assistants. That's much more common in the natural and the physical sciences in England. And in the social sciences, it tends to be a much more individual, personal, and in some ways lonely kind of existence. But at the start of my postgraduate career, I was lucky, firstly, that Cambridge was very definitely a centre of excellence in historical geography, as it seems to me it still is. And this meant that it attracted not only an extraordinarily lively staff, but also some very fine postgraduate students from all over the place. And there were, for example, Peter Cromer, whose dissertation was on the Tyneside coal industry and the emergence of monopoly in the northeast of England within that. And that was, of course, in part a rewriting of conventional historical geography, but it was also a sustained attack on the conventional categories of neoclassical economics as they'd come through into conventional location theory. There was Mark Overton, who has produced, I think, one of the most outstanding contributions to not just British historical geography, but the historical disciplines more widely, in his reconstruction of the agricultural revolution, so-called, in East Anglia. And that involved not simply a truly mammoth exercise in data extraction, working through probate inventories, travelling over to the record office in Norwich every day, jolting across the countryside in tiny little trains to work through these documents, come back, code them and put them through the computer. And in that sense produce a really remarkably detailed reconstruction of the changing agricultural geography of one of the focal areas in the debate over the agricultural revolution, but also a very careful examination of the deficiencies of diffusion theory, of the arguments surrounding the calculation of agricultural productivity and yields and so forth. So I was surrounded by some extraordinarily dedicated people, and in comparison with them, I must say, in those early days anyway, my own research, I think, never really got off the ground. I didn't go off into the archives and spend a long time, as Peter Cromer and Mark Overton did, digging out the data. I was based much more firmly in Cambridge. What I did share with them, though, I think, was that interest in theoretical critique. And I was initially attracted by the idea of applying systems theory as a viable methodology for saying something about processes of transformation. And what I wanted to do was to examine the transition from a domestic system to a factory system in the woolen industry of the West Riding of Yorkshire. But before I did that, and before I could go off to the archives, it seemed to me there was a tremendous amount of theoretical ground to be covered and cleared. You see, it's not the kind of study which admits of a single source interrogation in the Derby tradition. There wasn't one obvious body of data that I could go off to the archives and collect, or, as many of my contemporary colleagues still do, ring up a government ministry and ask to be sent by post. It was much more a question of trying to work out what information was available and how to stitch it together. And I wanted to have some design before I started. So I was much more firmly Cambridge-based than them, and spent part of my time exploring those sort of theoretical issues, and part of my time, I have to say, supervising undergraduates, far more than I should have done. And I suspect far more to my benefit than theirs. But it's there that I discovered that I enjoyed teaching, perhaps more than anything. And subsequently come to think that one of the main reasons that I do research is in order to teach, in order to talk about it with people, to have something to say, and to have those ideas challenged so that one is stretched and made to rethink all the time. That was exactly how my undergraduate career had developed under Dick Chorley, and it was therefore perhaps not surprising that just as he, for several years now, has not been a field man, I, at that time, was not a field man. I was not out in the landscape with the more traditional historical geographers, still less in the archives.
So it's fair to say you obviously had a feel for and a love for this discipline called geography. You're influenced immensely by Chorley. You're interested in systems. You become interested in systems in historical transformations. You enter the realm of historical geography. But clearly, if we look at the change in your work, or shifts in your work, philosophies and approaches, you've gone more and more away from systems as a beginning and end. You incorporate larger themes, larger concepts, larger methodologies, particularly something that we here call humanistic geography or historical humanistic geography. Could you trace for us briefly why you think you were led that way? First of all, is this true? Why you were led that way, if what I say is true? And secondly, get into the meaning of historical humanistic geography as you see it.
I'll try. I think the reason that historical geography attracted me on an intellectual basis was the deceptive simplicity of the adjective as much as the noun, in the sense that it didn't allow you to divide the past arbitrarily into economic geography, social geography, political geography. It was all of geography. And that seemed to me to be, in many ways, one of the central tenets of Chorley's systems theory too, that sense of holism and interconnection. And systems theory attracted me because it promised, at least, to provide some way of breaking open those interconnections, some way of being able to structure that rich, complicated web of interconnections in such a way that one could say something sensible about processes of change. Now, I began by constructing very formal models of domestic systems and factory systems. Initially, I think, very simple box and arrow diagrams, although, as anyone who's ever tried to design one soon discovers, simplicity is very rarely their hallmark, and it takes a tremendous amount of juggling around and ingenuity, not just in terms of design, but in terms of what you pour into the boxes before you come up with any kind of properly systematized representation of what you're about. And then I began to think in terms of the sort of mathematical and statistical methodologies that I might use to operationalize these models. But at about that time, and remember by then I'd started to teach at Cambridge courses in historical geography, I'd been joined by Richard Smith, himself a Cambridge postgraduate, several years my senior, working on the geography of medieval England, and in particular on the relationships with social history and demography. And Richard was particularly important to me, not just as a friend, but also as somebody who really opened my eyes to social theory and social history in a much more sustained way. Before, I think I'd had a rag-bag approach to the affair, that one could, so to speak, ride into the domain of other disciplines, rape, plunder and pillage a few concepts and drag them struggling back into one's own field. But Richard's approach was a much more meticulous, much more detailed affair. And it was through him, really, that I discovered the work of E.P. Thompson. It astonishes me now to think back of it, that I could have spent 3 years tackling historical geography at Cambridge without ever being introduced in any detailed way to the writings of E.P. Thompson and the sort of issues raised in books like The Making of the English Working Class. A book particularly important to me, you see, because so much of that was based on the West Riding of Yorkshire, on exactly the time period and the time scale that I was interested in. And I ended up in the rather curious situation of, during the day, or part of the day, constructing these elaborate, formal, abstract models of systems transformation, full of all the buzzwords. I could talk about principles of emergence, cycles of positive and negative feedback, the control valves, notions of homeostasis and equilibrium, and track through in that kind of way. And yet I'd go home in the evening and I'd start to read E.P. Thompson, and it was a completely different world. This was a landscape peopled with human beings. And in a way, the sort of landscapes that, for example, Darby was talking about in his early lectures to us were remarkably empty. They were full of trees, or progressively less full of trees as the wood was cleared. And they were made, yes, by people, but by prominent individuals, by people like Vermeiden, who drained the fens, Capability Brown, who laid out the landscape gardens and whatnot. But the people who actually did the draining of the fens, you see, the people who stood there with the water coming over their wellies, so to speak, the people who actually carved out those grand landscape gardens, who built the first canals, the first railways and so forth, very rarely appeared in those pages. And the same was true, I think, of some of the abstractions of systems theory, that the landscape appeared to develop almost autogenetically, without the hand of man, as David Stoddart always calls it. I think I would prefer to say the hand of man and woman, ever appearing. And yet there was Thompson, you see, whose landscapes, as I say, were full of people, and people who were not passive, people who actually had a very developed understanding of what was going on, imperfect and limited in all sorts of ways, as it was and as it must still be, but nevertheless whose knowledge and whose capacity for action was not incidental to the sort of transformations I was working on. So that I came to see Thompson's work as a very important challenge, partly because it was, to be frank, so much more exciting. It was so much more dramatic. But also, slowly and painfully, to see that it represented a very important theoretical challenge. I say slowly and painfully because, to all outward appearances, at any rate, Thompson avoids any kind of formal theoretical apparatus. And he has the greatest distrust and suspicion of theory with a capital T and science with a capital S. I think much of that is misplaced, and I think there is a very definite theoretical structure at work in Thompson's writings. And it took me some while to begin to decode that and see what this theoretical concern underpinning his writings was, and clearly it revolved around questions of human agency. And beginning to put those two halves together, the formal models of systems theory on the one hand, and this raging drama of human agency on the other, I came to see that the deficiencies of systems theory, and I think that there are some important strengths of it, but the deficiencies of systems theory, the difficulty of providing a rigorous account of historical transformation, were all to do with their restriction or suppression of the role of the knowledgeable human subject and the importance of human agency within those systems, bounded by those structures. And so that's what led me still further into social theory. But it began very much, I think, through Richard Smith and through that empirical engagement with E.P. Thompson's marvellous book.
And so we have a search for various means, forms, ways to insert human agency into the schema, into the formula, into the interpretation. Let's stop for a moment before we pursue that, and let me ask the question, and I know you have problems with definitions. Is that a fair definition? Is that a fair way to begin to approach an understanding of what constitutes humanistic geography, if indeed there's... We use the term, so let's assume that we have a definition of it. If there is something called humanistic geography, is it the focal point of inserting human agency into the interpretation that is the cohesive or unifying point for that group of work?
I think that's an important starting point, but I think I do differ from many who would call themselves humanistic geographers. I very rarely think of myself as a humanistic geographer in a number of ways. Firstly, because I think that it's too easy to appeal to human agency as some kind of talisman, as though it's something that is so self-evidently important that simply by introducing people, by letting them clamber over these systems and toil away inside these structures, we've added the appropriate elements to our explanations. I think that human agency is genuinely problematic, and the question of how we conceive of the human subject is extraordinarily difficult. That's one of my current concerns. The second is that so many writings in the humanistic tradition seem to me to refuse the insights which, yes, systems theory and structural Marxism, for example, can offer, the sense in which social practice and social life is bounded by systems and structures which typically extend beyond the reach of the knowing subject. And so, yes, it is a concern with human agency that I've been trying to pursue, but it's a concern which recognises that human agency is itself problematic and that it is in no sense self-sufficient. What I mean by that is that human agency really has no meaning outside of particular systems and structures which make it possible.
Mm-hmm.
But co-equally, of course, those systems and structures, for the most part, simply couldn't be produced and reproduced without the mediation of conscious, creative human agency. So it's not simply a retreat into the innermost recesses of the mind, for example. I hope it's not simply an emotional appeal to a presumed common humanity which we all share. Important though those emotional responses are, I think they don't remove from us the duty to understand the theoretical difficulties that opens up. You see, I think a lot of work in so-called humanistic geography fits remarkably closely with the sort of strictures that Darby was applying. If you take his making of the English landscape again, you can see there, as I've said, that so much of the landscape is seen through the eyes of the prominent and the powerful. He was quite clear that this was a geography of, not a geography of doomsday England, but a doomsday geography of England. The difference is important. It wasn't providing a detailed reconstruction of England in the 11th century. What it was reconstructing the landscape through the eyes of the commissioners sent out by William the Conqueror, you see. Exactly the same applies to the draining of the fen. You're seeing the thing essentially from the standpoint of Vermeiden and his grand scheme to construct what I guess Dick Chorley would call a controlled system. Now, when one turns to some of the published examples in humanistic geography, I think much the same applies. Leonard Gelke's book on idealism in historical geography provides a simple sketch of the colonization of colonial Africa by the Dutch, and much of it is seen from the point of view of the governor of that colony. And you see, you're still not getting hold of those people that are important. I think it's one thing to begin by saying one of the failings of conventional geography was that it concerned itself with the location of factories, let's say, from the point of view of the entrepreneur, the businessman, the key decision maker, without ever recognizing that people had to work in those factories and without ever being concerned about their social worlds. But it's quite another to then move on and actually make sense of the constructions of those people themselves, particularly in the past, of course, because it's so much harder. By and large, those people do not provide us with the detailed records, the policy documents and the carefully polished statements preserved for posterity that the powerful and the influential do. But that isn't to say that their part in history is purely passive. And it's that excites me.
I see. When you approach an historical topic from a systemic or systems viewpoint and are out of the positivist tradition, there is a format, a template laid out for you. Follow these rules, follow this procedure, and you come to an acceptable form of interpretation or explanation. When those of us that ask for that from the historical, and allow me to use the term again, humanistic side, of where is that template, that pattern, to insert human agency, I'm not sure it exists. Therefore, we're told that it should be done, but we're not necessarily told how it's done. We all recognize when it's done. We read E.P. Thompson and say, perhaps it's done. We read good works by historical geographers and say, yes, it has been done. But it's extremely difficult to transfer how it's been done. It's almost you either have the ability to do it or you don't have the ability to do it. Would you take up on that particular issue?
I think I would put it like this, that certainly one of the traditions of postgraduate research in Britain has been to conduct research and to write theses on a very conventional linear model in which you examine the literature, provide some kind of theoretical critique, set up your hypotheses or construct your model, collect the data, and write up the results. The difficulty with that, I think, is firstly the separations it makes between philosophy, theory, method, and empirical work, and essentially the kind of unilinear track which runs from one to the other. But the other objection is that time and time again you will hear postgraduates say, well, I've completed the research, all I have to do now is write it up, as though writing was not somehow an intimate part of the research process. It wasn't equally important, equally creative. Now, I think the difficulty emerges in relation to your question, because I think in principle, and even in abstract theoretical terms, it isn't too difficult to understand the importance of connecting up agency and structure, however one might formulate that. And even devising abstract models, which, to a greater or lesser degree, are plausible demonstrations of that. The example that Giddens uses, for example, in his theory of structuration, is that of language. Each time I speak, I draw upon a pre-existing linguistic structure. Now, I may not be able to specify in any formal way the rules and resources that it makes available, and certainly once I get much beyond elementary grammar and syntax, it would be impossible for me to do so. I don't have that kind of training. So those structures are a condition of every intelligible speech act that I make. At the same time, though, if I didn't have some knowledge, some discursive and practical penetration of those structures, that's to say, if I wasn't able to draw upon those rules and resources as a knowledgeable human subject, then the speech act would be impossible. Each time I draw upon them, I then reproduce those structures, whether I wish to do so or not. The importance of that example, I think, is not to suggest that social life is in any sense just like language, but rather to say that what we can learn from the traditions of systems theory and structural Marxism is the importance of those unacknowledged conditions of action, if you like, the existence of these systems and structures which are the condition for our behaving as we do. And at the same time, the existence of the unintended consequences which flow from our actions. But it also, you see, makes us realise the centrality of the knowledgeable human subject to that whole scheme of things, to this movement between agency and structure. Now, we can do that in the abstract, as I say, and that is, I think, a plausible model. The problem comes when we try to translate that into empirical research, and in particular in the writing of empirical research, because I think it would be quite illegitimate to suggest that one first of all reconstructs the systems and structures and, so to speak, presents those to the reader, then turns to the question of agency and presents those, and leaves it to the reader to make some kind of mystical interpenetration of the one by the other. Rather, I think what it suggests is that one needs some kind of theoretically informed narrative. And you see, that's why I object to the standard linear mode of presenting research. There isn't any narrative there. You don't have that free flow between agency and structure. You don't have the sense of a developing, changing, dynamic social world. So I think the problems are as much to do with presentation, with how we actually convey that sense of richness and dynamism, as to do with the theoretical concepts we might use to interrogate it. I think the theoretical concepts are being developed, sure enough, but in highly abstract ways, and what's needed is a reworking of those concepts in particular empirical contexts. And that's where I think geography has one of its major contributions to make in that empirical domain. Because in many ways, this may surprise you, but I do see geography as very much a concrete empirical science.
Let's shift gears just slightly. In comparing British historical geography to that which we find in North America, particularly in U.S. universities, what would you see as the major strength, and are there differences between the approaches in general? And what do you see as the strength and weaknesses, if there are differences between the two approaches?
I don't think that I would distinguish them by countries particularly. I think there are differences of emphasis, but I think it would be very difficult and very wrong of me to suggest that there was an orthodoxy in British historical geography, or even that there was an orthodoxy within, let's say, Cambridge historical geography. It ought to follow from the kind of theoretical argument that I've made so far that although we are, yes, bounded by particular systems and structures as geographers, there are certain disciplinary conventions, certain social conventions, if you like, which arise in the settings in which we work, so that perhaps there is a cohesiveness to historical geography at Cambridge, different from the cohesiveness one might find among historical geography at University College London, say, or Liverpool or Oxford. Nevertheless, each of us, I think, has got our own very different perspective. We come together in certain ways, and we argue in many others. So I'd find it very difficult to characterise British historical geography in that kind of way. I don't think it makes much sense to reconstruct its history, for example, in terms of either a few prominent individuals which you line up in the right sequence. Neither do I think it makes much sense to see it in terms of a succession of paradigms with an internal cohesiveness. Rather, I think it's a series of constantly changing alliances and interests. Because you've got to remember in British historical geography that so many people have been trained in it and have gone on to other things. David Harvey, David Smith, for example, and even gone on to other countries, as in the United States. And even within historical geography, people's interests change and develop. Alan Baker's work, for example, was initially on medieval field systems. And although that was conducted under the watchful eyes of H.C. Darby, it was in no sense a simple landscape-bound study. It was something which involved, it seems to me anyway, a very careful understanding of debates in anthropology over inheritance systems, which were very much outside that kind of Darby tradition. But then, when he moved to Cambridge, he became interested, for all sorts of reasons, in France in the 19th century, and in the transformation of peasant economies, and within that scheme of things, beginning initially in terms of, again, a formal location theory, looking at patterns of rural settlement, patterns and structures in the landscape, but then shifting gear and coming to focus on questions of organisation, political movements, the transformation of these peasant societies in much more directly social and cultural terms. So there's that tremendous kind of variety and diversity, which in some ways perhaps is a weakness, curiously enough, because there aren't many of us. I suspect the same is true of North American historical geography. And I think what we sometimes forget when we lay out these grand maps of the field and when we offer critiques of what's been achieved is that there still aren't many of us. And that makes it very difficult sometimes to pursue detailed debates. Particular areas of interest develop, certainly, but very often in an ephemeral fashion as people's interests change and develop.
Well, let me rephrase the question slightly then, and see if this is fair. I would suggest that a large amount of historical geography done in North America can be directly linked to the Darby tradition, or its manifestation as it appears here in the United States, in which one is sketching man-land issues, material issues through time. That's not to suggest other kinds of historical geography are not pursued, but rather that seems to be a large segment of the work. Whereas I see, correctly or not, that British historical geographers have been much quicker to move into issues that attempt to connect the material to the social. Now, perhaps that's not true, perhaps I'm overstating the case, but clearly there are those two camps. Those who stick mainly with the material, and those who attempt to connect the material with the social. And my suggestion is perhaps, or perhaps I'm just overly influenced by certain people in England, that it seems to, that second tradition seems to have emanated from England as opposed to the United States. Now, do you believe that? Is that necessarily true? And if so, why?
Well, I think that I teach a course in Cambridge on the historical geography of North America, and I have to say that most of the work that I've drawn upon, and most of the materials that I refer my students to, is by, I suppose, American social historians rather than by American historical geographers. But I think that may be simply a matter of my own ignorance of the American literature, as much as any difference between what I'm interested in and what historical geographers in North America are interested in. But in terms of British historical geography, I think it's true that there is an increasing interest in questions of materialism, and in particular, of course, historical materialism, which I think can be explained in a number of ways. I think you see, in the course of those debates over functionalism and systems theory within geography in the 60s, historical geography was thrown very much on the defensive, certainly in Britain. And those debates were certainly not absent from the Cambridge department. And in many cases, I think, although lots of people carried on doing what they'd always done and objected very strongly to the encroachments of conventional spatial science, there were others who came to see historical geography and its survival, largely in terms of applying those models of spatial science to the past, in effect using the past as a laboratory, as a kind of experiment in which you could extend back and somehow strengthen the conventional models of spatial science. And in a way, you can see why that's so much easier in the British case, where you've got this cartographic tradition coming from Derby, where there was already this concern with the deployment of data in the spatial domain. And once you've got the map, it's a very short step from that to abstract from it, to decompose it, as Haggett did in locational analysis, into systems of nodes, networks, hierarchies, surfaces, and the like. But that, you see, meant that from a position where historical geography had historically itself some kind of central, focal role within the discipline, it was really moved out to the periphery, because the historicality, the historicity of historical geography, if you like, the sense in which it was indeed dealing with the past in large measure for its own sake, the sense in which it was concerned with historical specificity, with historical transformation, really disappeared from view. It was simply a testing ground, as I say, for models which were essentially about the present. Historical materialism became attractive, I think, in some ways, because it meant the reintroduction of historicity. It meant that we began to understand the need for historical depth in explanation and understanding, that we were unwilling to extend these abstract models over space and through time, and that we were unwilling to freeze the present and make all our models simply endless variations on the same static theme. That explains, I think, the adjective historical. The materialism is also, I think, important in British historical geography, because it does introduce in a very central way that relationship between society and nature. And it's meant, I think, directly or indirectly, that an increasing number of remarkably talented historical geographers in Britain have come to tackle questions of society and nature, paleo-environments and environmental change, in ways which are certainly beyond my competence to understand, but which I think do build all sorts of bridges back into that North American tradition that you spoke about.
The typical response, perhaps, that one hears bandied about in the hallways of the AAG meetings or whatever, between those who look for generalizations as opposed to those who don't. is that the very beauty of historical approaches, that which inserts time, that which inserts complexity, that which inserts change, invariably leads one away from generalization. I don't think that's necessarily so. It doesn't have to. But my question to you is, as a general rule, do you think that that has happened among historical geographers? And secondly, if so, is there a medium ground with which the complexity can be used, to use a Chorley term, fed back into the general?
Well, I think there are a number of possible strategies. Certainly, I think the simplest is the one I've just described, in which you take a generalization, a simple model, idealized and abstracted as it is, and simply try and apply it, either to test the model, or, as so often was the case, to test the past, to see to what extent those generalizations can obtain in different contexts. But it's never been very clear to me at the end of the day what the product of that kind of exercise is. If, and just putting on one side for the moment all the problems about hypothesis testing and the difficulties that entails, if, for example, the model fails to work in the past for whatever reason, does that tell us something about the model? Does it tell us something about the past? Or does it tell us nothing about either? And I think one of the major problems has to do with the structure of those models themselves. I think many of the early models in physical geography had at least the merit of working. One could argue about the detailed mechanics of the thing, one could argue about their mathematical form and the way in which the equations snap together. But by and large, in physical geography, it was accepted, for instance, that rivers flow downhill. The problem, I think, with some of the early models in human geography, which were being applied, past and present, was that they manifestly didn't work. The justification for that was always, well, they give us a yardstick. This is some way in which we can measure the way in which the real world deviates from this idealized situation. But if that were a viable research strategy, then presumably physical geography could just as happily assume that rivers flow uphill and measure deviations from it. But the fact that they don't, the fact that physical geographers have made the tremendous advances that they have, I think has got a lot to do with formulating the models properly to begin with. And I think the same, therefore, has to be carried over into human geography if we want to make that sort of distinction, to construct models which, in the human landscape, rivers are flowing downhill. Now, that means that we have to think very carefully about the sort of generalizations that we have on offer. And I think it means two things in particular. It means, firstly, that comparative research is extraordinarily important. And I think one of the deficiencies of my work, and probably of geography more generally, is an unwillingness to conduct comparative research. Not in the sense of aiming for cross-cultural generalization over space and through time, but in the sense of getting a more sensitive understanding of the particularities that we're dealing with. The second element, I think, is to conduct our research in such a way that we're concerned more with abstraction than with generalization. What I mean by that, to take your example of complexity, is that given the richness of this nexus of interconnections, our problem, I think, is to capture parts of that, to abstract elements in meaningful interconnection. Not because we can then apply the same patterns, the same formal systems, to other richly complicated situations, but rather because that whole process of abstraction enables us to say something very, very precise indeed about particular places and the people that live in them, but in a way which is theoretically informed. So my answer to you, I think, is essentially to suggest that it's abstraction that's the key rather than generalization.
Fair enough. But let's go back to your example. All right. You're suggesting then that the very premises by which, we use to make generalizations when we're talking about human agency or human activity are inherently incorrect. To go back to your analogy, we can see that rivers flow downhill. What do we see when we look at human agency? And is the template that we've constructed sufficient, or at least coming close to what we see? And so the historical geographers begin to look at this and then suggest that it isn't so, that people are not acting in the way that the assumptions and the models are built. I suppose the critique that one could come back with is that the historical geographers perhaps do not give then the model a substitution, do not provide a new elaboration for what should be. Is that fair?
To some extent I think it is, because I don't think historical geography or any other part of the social sciences has got some ready-made answer to the problem of human agency. And I take the point that it's not really enough to continually sit there and carp from the sidelines and object that, well, the world, isn't made up of a set of isotropic surfaces, of equilibrating spatial processes and rational economic men and women. That's not a desperately profound observation. It's much more important to come in off the sidelines and actually begin to construct a much more viable understanding. But I think that's as much an empirical as it is a theoretical question, you see. And if you're asking me to provide some kind of theoretical sketch of the character and nature of human agency, I would, I think, insist on it being, at least in part, historically specific. How we understand the relations between agency and structure, for example, is not something that can be divorced from historical context and from particular people and the positions and places they find themselves in. Human agency, for example, in classical Rome was clearly very different from human agency in feudal England, very different again from human agency in the early Industrial Revolution. So those relationships between agency and structure are, I think, sufficiently historically specific for us to be able to make certain very risky forays, abstractions, generalizations.
Are they spatially specific as well?
I think they are, in the sense that they're not only timescale specific, but I think it must follow that they're space scale specific too. And I think, you see, we're only at the beginnings of being able to understand this and probe into it. The difficulty, I think, with so many regional studies in the past is that people interested in one region and the kind of work that's been going on there have very rarely talked to people interested in another kind of region. And so the relationships between these various scale levels over space and time have been obscured. I suppose physical geographers have had the same problem. That's to say that they think scale is a problem, that generalizations that hold at one scale level are reversed at another. But I think they're beginning to understand far more clearly than do human geographers that these scale questions of space and time might provide, as Barbara Kennedy puts it, not a straitjacket for the subject, but its very outline, its very skeleton. And I think the same is true of human geography. One of the reasons I think that this comparative work is important is that if it's conducted across a sufficient number of time and space scales, we can begin to understand those very specific relationships between agency and structure at a whole series of different levels.
Fine. Let me shift gears. Let's talk about systems a bit. Of course, we all know that the classic introductory lecture on the development of systems theory, or systemic structures, deals with a dissatisfaction, even among positivists, with the simplicity with which the basic models that science and social science were developing, the inadequacies of that simplicity, in an attempt to look at the holistic, to look at the broader implications, the complexity, the attributes and the components. And therefore the search for a language, for a structure, which would help people identify and model that complexity. That's my interpretation, nevertheless, of how simple it may be of the origins in North America. Is this also true in England?
The dissatisfaction with
Yes.
systems theory.
No. The dissatisfaction with the simplicity as the rise for the development of an interest in.
I think
Systems.
in large measure that's true, but I think it's also got a lot to do with the methods of the hard-edged sciences, so to speak, and formal scientific logic. I think it's got a lot to do too with a concern with identifying the processes that are at work rather than the simple morphological forms. But underpinning all of that certainly is this attempt to retain a sense of complexity. And that's obviously not just common to systems theory. One of, I think, Levi-Strauss's more prescient observations was that the whole object of scientific explanation is not to make the complex simple, but to make a complexity which is unintelligible, intelligible. And I think that's the key, that these systems models were intended to be models of intelligibility, which retained something of the richness and the interconnections, and unravelled them in a coherent sense.
Well, I wish we could pursue this topic of systems a bit more. Perhaps I can ask you a very brief question to end it, and that would be, when all was said and done, did not systems modeling in geography specifically really lead to complex descriptions and never developed an alternative form of explanation?
I think what it gestured towards were some of the places where explanation might be found. That's to say, explanations wouldn't be found in formal terms, in terms of the formal apparatus of systems theory. I mean, negative and positive feedback isn't an explanation, it's a description. And what systems theory invites us to do is unpack those boxes and identify those processes. And as I said right at the very beginning, it was in unpacking those boxes, in trying to look at those mechanisms and processes, that I realised that there were people in there, caught among the cogs, so to speak, and it was important to try to recover them and bring those into the framework of a much more inclusive human geography.
Well, with that, we thank you, Derek
Thank you.
Gregory,